Got another video here on the thoughts or on the nature of God and reality. Today I want to talk about, this isn't really the nature of God or reality. This is about giving to the church, because this is a concept that I've found weird in the past. The idea of like donating money to a church. Actually, I don't find it weird. I find it pretty normal and acceptable, a thing. But I learned about this weird thing a couple months ago actually, about 6 or 7 months ago really. So almost half a year ago, more than half a year ago, 8 months ago. Wow, time flies. Anyway, so my friend who's from Austria said that they have this thing called a church tax in Austria, and you have to sign a paper to stop like paying the church tax. And they're basically like, if you don't pay your church tax, you're going to hell. And people are like, oh fuck, well I'll pay my church tax. And then when you sign this paper, they're like, well, you're signing your way into hell. And it's like, dude, that's crazy, bro. That's insane. That's like the church has lost their fucking marbles, at least in Austria. We don't do that in America, which is great. But I do have thoughts about the idea of giving money to churches in America. So first off, there's this idea that if you give money to the church, then God will bless your finances. And I'll go more in depth on that later, but I could definitely see how this is off-turning by people, or turns people off, because it's like, you know, it kind of feels like the church is trying to like manipulate money out of you. And then it's like, shouldn't giving money to the church just be a matter of like, you know, goodwill? If you are Christian, you're on board with all this stuff. You don't want to be doing it like a contract, like, okay, God, I'm going to give you this much money, but I expect money in return, or whatever. That just doesn't feel too right, especially if you've already accepted the existence of God, you're a fan of Jesus. That feels conflicting. But you still perhaps want to give money to the church. And, well, let's say that the only churches that are present to you are bad churches, right? The kinds of churches that are making people, you know, pay church tax, and like, if you don't want to pay it, you're going to hell. It's like, the point of church is to have a community surrounding building relationship with God, and people within that community all share in this relationship with God. They understand, they give you advice and guidance, you give them advice and guidance, and perhaps you go on adventures as well, as I've done with many of the friends that I've met at church. It's a fantastic community. And so that's the purpose. And then as a part of that, you have this leader who is dedicated his life to studying the nature of God through the lens of the Bible, and articulating ideas within the Bible to the members of the church. And that's really good, pretty solid. And of course the church falls short in many ways. It's got all kinds of problems, but if you go to one of these churches that has all kinds of problems and is not actually leading people closer to relationship with God, then you probably shouldn't be giving to that church, because the purpose of giving your money to the church is to help more people come into relationship with God. And if the church you're giving your money to is in fact acting as a barrier between people and God, then should you really be giving your money to that church? And is that, you know, perhaps it's like, oh, and now God is going to bless my finances, but it's like, do you want to support that kind of a system? And I know many churches, or I know many people who have been to these kinds of churches that stand between people and God, and so they've turned away from the church. It's like, hey man, like, fair enough, like, these churches were not doing their job in some sense. And so it's interesting, but if you do find a church that is genuinely bringing people into closer relationship with God, as I found, there's this church called Beacon down in Denver, and it's a fantastic church. CB, our pastor, is an absolute genius. He's grounded, he's disciplined, he's focused, he's compassionate, he's a great guy. And he's really good at articulating ideas, and he's a great speaker. He acts things out, he's joyful, he's having fun when he's up there, he's singing, he's dancing. So a fantastic church. It's got an amazing community. People are caring, and I don't want to go on too much of a tangent, but I think the thing that's really cool about this church, and if you've been to most churches, especially like, I don't want to sound like a total liberal here, but like whitewashed, like, you know, rich churches where you show up, it's like everybody's fucking like white, they're like copies of one another, and they're all like, oh, they're super pious, they're overwhelmingly pious, and they don't swear, and although the CB at my church is always like, don't swear, it's bad, and I'm like, but you go to these churches and I lost my freaking train of thought. The point is, right, it's everyone's putting forth this facade. Whereas I think when you go to Beacon, when CB put this church together, it's been about 4 or 5 years, he found people, his first members were from homeless shelters, jails, prisons, rehab centers. And he went to these places and he found like the quote unquote broken and built a whole church around them. And now it's like the deacons of this church are people who like flew drugs for the cartel and have been through like crazy shit, man, on drugs for like 18, 20 years and like just got like 2 years of sobriety. And it's like, that's insane. But I think the reason I found this church so compelling is because you're actually meeting people where they have a close relationship with God. Or maybe the reason this church is so powerful is because the people in this church have a close relationship with God, and they have a close relationship with God because God has had a powerful effect on their life. And they were in need. They needed that growth. And so there's something much more like real about it. Anyway, and something, you know, you go to this church and CB always talks about like, look, man, you can't rely on me to build your relationship with God. I can fill you in, give you some information, give you some ideas about the nature of God, and I can articulate things in the Bible, and he does a great job at that. But it's like, you got to go home and you've got to read your Bible, and you've got to pray, and you've got to make the hard decisions that God calls you to make. And I find this very compelling. Anyway, it's a very different church. So I found this church and I was like, and I've been to a lot of churches. I think I mentioned in the introduction, dude, I went to one church and I had friends who went to this church, so I just went with them. They were swing dancing friends and they were good people. But I went to this church and they had a freaking laugh track, or not a laugh track, a clap track going. He would like say some shit, there'd be like clapping. I was like, bro, what is going on? Like, that's literal bullshit. The church I go to, Beacon, it's like people are yelling, people are hooting and hollering. There's a praise pit where people go and they're all like dancing. It's really cool. So when I go to this church, it's like, this place is bringing me closer to God, and I think we would live in a better world if more people were closer to God. So it's like, I'm gonna fucking give them my money so they can do this on a larger scale, and they can be more functional, and they can grow, and they can reach more people because there's something real to it. But I'm not gonna give my money to a church that's overly pious, has this pious facade that demonizes people's flaws, that doesn't give people the room or space to grow, and frankly makes a bad image for the Bible, because there are a lot of churches that are doing that. But the churches, or the Bible does tell us to, you know, give our money to the church. And I guess in some sense it's like, I just feel lucky that I've found a church that I want to give my money to. I'm like hyped to every time I give them money. I'm like, hey, let's go. They're gonna grow, they're gonna get bigger, they're gonna have a bigger community, we're gonna move into a better building soon. It's not like I'm giving them that much money. I've got like no income. I'll have some income soon, but it's fulfilling, and it's intrinsically rewarding, I guess. And then I will say, only like a few months after I did that job, this guy literally like came into my life, and a few months after, or maybe even just a few weeks after I started giving to the church. And if you've seen my business vlogs, you've seen how I've been like attempting to, you know, get some kind of online programming job. That's kind of been the dream for a while. Basically, I've been going to this kickboxing thing, and this guy that I met in kickboxing, I invited me to do a sparring session. I went to the sparring session, and I met this other guy who was interested in this app that I've been developing. We put together a lunch just to talk about it. He was like, I've got a job for you, man. And he hooked me up with the CEO of a startup company that just got budgeted like $50 million of funding. And theoretically, she just like gave me a job. I'm starting in like a month, and granted, it could always fall through, who knows, but it was weird. And I'm not a fan of being like, oh, I'm gonna give my money and then God's gonna get me money. But it did kind of feel like this trust fall where I was like, hey man, I don't know where like my money's coming from. I took classes this summer. Normally over summers I work construction, but I took classes. I didn't work construction. I got this job, and now it's like, theoretically I'll have some income. And it kind of felt like when I started giving it, it was like I felt like my finances were about to be blessed. And I guess technically they were, with like the best job ever. I mean, maybe not the best job ever, but it's a really cool job where it's bringing AI to geology. Yes, geology. So rocks. I don't know much beyond that, but I'll be a programmer for them. It's totally online. I can get a year or 2 years of experience before I graduate college. If I want to continue to do that after I graduate, I can travel the world. And that's been my dream, was to graduate college, have some kind of online job, and then go travel the world. And at that point, I could get a raise. Like, it's just, it felt like my finances were blessed. So I will say, maybe there is some kind of divine intervention when you give your money to the church, but I don't think you should do it from that place. I think you should do it, and that's just my experience, where it's like I started giving them, hey, money, and I think a lot of people do have this experience where they're like, oh shit, here's the money. But I think that you should value your relationship with God, and if you find a church that helps people build a relationship with God, then you should give them money and help other people build a relationship with God, and help them build up the community that you're a part of more. And then I know everybody's like, you got to help participate, you got to come set up and clean up. I actually do that at my church just because I want to. And I think if you don't want to, maybe you're not at the right church. Anyway, so that's a little bit of a side thought, not really a nature of God in reality, but something that I thought about, and honestly something that kind of inspired this series, because I think it's a unique and honest perspective that is maybe not like super right, but is how I see it. And there you have it. All right, farewell. See you next time.